Welcome to Literary and Jury Charge Practice. Let's get started with this short jury charge. We'll get our fingers warmed up. Ready? Here we go. Discrepancies in a witness's testimony or between his testimony and that of others, if there was any, do not necessarily mean that the witness should be discredited. Failure of recollection is a common experience, and innocent misrecollection is not uncommon. Also, it is a fact that two persons witnessing an incident or a transaction often will see or hear it differently. Whether a discrepancy pertains to a fact of importance or only to a trivial detail should be considered in weighing its significance. You are not bound to decide in conformity with the testimony of a number of witnesses that does not produce conviction in your mind as against the testimony of a lesser number of other evidence that appeals to your mind with more convincing force. This does not mean that you are at liberty to disregard the testimony of the greater number of witnesses merely from caprice or prejudice or from a desire to favor one side as against the other. It does mean that you are not to decide an issue by the simple process of counting the number of witnesses who have testified on the opposing sides. It means that the final test is not in the relative number of witnesses, but in the relative convincing force of the evidence. Remember that you are not bound to decide any question of fact according to the testimony of a large number of witnesses as against a lesser number of witnesses when such evidence does not produce conviction in your mind. The test to be given to testimony is not merely the number of witnesses, but rather the weight to which the testimony of such witness or witnesses is entitled. All right, I hope you're feeling warmed up. Now let's try this jury charge. And the subject of this jury charge is income tax evasion. Ready? In order to prove the guilt of the defendant upon any of the 8 counts of the indictment in this case, the government must establish with respect to such count by evidence in the case and to a moral certainty and beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant willfully attempted to defeat and evade a large part of the income tax due and owing for the years in question by filing or causing to be filed a false and fraudulent return. To do so, the government must prove to a moral certainty and beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following matters and things. 1. That the defendant filed or caused to be filed the income tax returns set forth in each of the counts of the indictment. 2. That the income tax returns were false in that they did not correctly set forth all the taxable income for the years in question. 3. That the defendant knew that the income tax returns were false and did not set forth all the taxable income for the years in question. 4. That the defendant filed or caused the income tax returns to be filed with the specific intent upon his part to evade the payment of income tax to the United States and to defraud the United States out of such additional income tax as would have been due had the full income for each of said years been reported in the income tax returns. 5. That there was due to the United States for the years in question income taxes over and above that reported or paid for the years in question. If the government fails to prove any one of the foregoing essential elements of the offenses for which the defendant is on trial to a moral certainty and beyond a reasonable doubt, or if you have a reasonable doubt as to whether the defendant did willfully attempt to evade income tax due and owing by him as charged in any count of the indictment, you must find the defendant not guilty of such count or counts of the indictment. On the other hand, if you find the necessary and essential elements of the offenses charged in the indictment to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt as to any particular count, it would be your duty to find the defendant guilty of the crime charged in such count. The word willfully, when used in this criminal statute, means something more than intentional. It generally means an act done with a bad purpose, a purpose to do wrong without justifiable excuse. The word is also employed to characterize a thing done without ground for believing it is lawful, or conduct marked by careless disregard as to whether one has the right so to act. An evil motive is a constituent element of the crimes charged against the defendant. It is not necessary for the government to offer direct proof of willfulness. It is a rare case in which a defendant has said to a witness that he did certain acts for the purpose of evading his tax liabilities. In making your decision, therefore, as to whether or not the acts of the defendant in failing to include in his income tax returns monies received by him were willful, you may consider all of the circumstances of the case. You may infer willfulness from the kind of evasion, if any, which you find the defendant committed from his opportunity to know the true amount of his income, and from such other facts which might point to the existence or non-existence of a criminal state of mind for the defendant. We will finish this one later. For now, let's see what we have in the way of some literary material. Let's finish this literary on The Strange Case of the Boston Strangler. Ready? I remember this case because I knew all of the principals except Nasser and Hurkos. I was always impressed with Bailey's ability in every respect, and I had reported many of his cases. He graduated from Boston University with the highest grade point average in its history, and he was a superb speaker. Kahn, the prosecutor, was a fine attorney. He was always glad to see me because he said that he won all of his cases when I was the reporter. Bottomley also was a first-rate attorney and was held in high esteem. But after millions of words have been written about the Boston Strangler, including a blizzard of articles by the print media, an avalanche of official and unofficial pronouncements by those supposedly in the know, and a few books that have been published about this intriguing case, the final question still remains: was DeSalvo the Boston Strangler? The question may never be answered with absolute finality, and that is why I still continue to think of this case as the strange case of the Boston Strangler. Let's see what else we have. have in the way of literary material. This is called Most Simple Appears Too Simple. Ready? During private coaching, a professional recently said, "The weak point is finding a direction." This experienced court reporter has reported work that is impressive. Each day she preserves the record. Each day her world is filled with lay testimony, expert witnesses, and multiple surprises. How does one find a direction when swimming like a salmon upstream? Most simple appears too simple, was my reply. I hoped that I did not sound like a Chinese fortune cookie. Court reporters, broadcast captioners, cart providers, and students with whom I work often share so many words about what they are trying to do to expand their skills. The emphasis was on trying to change a well-honed, finely tuned discipline. The majority of people I listen to now want to work from home. They want to work over the internet. Now, the majority of individuals within our field who are changing their goals are older by their own admission, and many have children who are not underfoot, a frequent description. When we court reporters, captioners, cart providers, and students take dictation at school, we process words. We work with accuracy, speed, and instant translation. How can I be expected to write every word in the dictionary, is one question I am asked. I am asked this question so frequently that I try not to gasp and think of the court reporting instructors, firm owners, and captioning managers who would swat me if they could for not answering that one question succinctly. I know I could open a can of small insects here for sharing that I do ask when each person attended school. A sizable percentage has never set foot in a school or online program, nor do many intend to by their own words. Many insist they want a free education, yet they ask how they can earn top dollar working from home once they are ready. To assist individuals to reach their goals, I ask questions which are always answered with great honesty. Each time I hear their truth, their knowledge, I am honored. It's not easy to answer, as someone recently said, about my wants and all. Get back to our jury charge. On income tax evasion. Ready? The defendant is not charged with concealing or attempting to conceal the gross or net income received by him or by his wife or the sources thereof, but with willfully attempting to defeat and evade income tax. It is not sufficient for the government, in order to establish the guilt of the defendant under any count of the indictment, merely to prove that the return mentioned in each account of the indictment understated the income for the year in question, or the amount of tax due thereon. The government must prove to a moral certainty and beyond a reasonable doubt that said returns containing an underestimate of said income were filed not by reason of mere carelessness or negligence, but were filed knowingly and willfully by the defendant with knowledge on the part of said defendant that such returns did not correctly set forth all of the said income, and that said defendant filed the same with intent to defraud the United States out of the amount of tax that would be due to the United States. Even though you may find from the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant failed to report all taxable income for the years in question in the returns filed with the Director of Internal Revenue, nevertheless, if you also find or have a reasonable doubt that the defendant believed that the unreported amount of such income was not taxable under the provisions of the Internal Revenue Code, the defendant would not be guilty of the count of the indictment with respect to which you so find. All right, let's try some more literary material. This is called An Officer Testifies. Ready? In this case, there are two officers. I would have one officer guard the suspect and the other officer stretch his hand out and shine a flashlight over that fence to see if there was somebody on the other side. I am very safety oriented and I like to protect myself. Next, I would not approach the suspect until he had a proper search. My first contact with the situation was an FBI course that I took, and they listed a number of officers who had been shot with their own guns. It is recommended that when you approach, you give your gun to your partner and he stands off some distance to one side so that you are not in a crossfire. If he did have to fire, he wouldn't hit the other officer. I am talking about at least 6 feet so that the suspect couldn't lunge and grab his gun. There have been a considerable number of cases where the gun has been taken from the officer. So I would have held off until such time as the suspect was in position for a proper wall search, and that is where his feet are out so far that he could not possibly push himself back. Then, at such time, if you can reach him, grab him with your left hand by the belt, and then you can sense any movement if he were to try to push back. He shouldn't be able to do that if he is in the proper search position. You have control over him and you can control his movements. Another thing, I think probably the first order I would give him would be to get those hands up. Get them up on top of his head. That would be my first concern. Get those hands where I can see them. In other words, I want him to know he had better get those hands up. Once the hands are up and I can see there are no weapons, then I would instruct him to go over against the fence or the wall. Alright, let's try this jury charge practice, and this is a different jury charge but the subject is also income tax evasion on this one. Let's give it a try. Ready? The first step in arriving at the income of a taxpayer upon which a tax is imposed is the determination of the gross income of the individual. Gross income includes income derived from salaries, wages, commissions, or compensation for personal service of whatever kind and in whatever form paid, or from businesses, commerce, or sales, also from interest, rents, dividends, securities, or the transaction of any business carried on for gain or profit, or gains or profits, and income derived from any source whatever. Of course, there must be excluded under the provisions of the Revenue Acts certain items such as life insurance, annuities, property acquired by gift, bequest, devise, or inheritance, and other items set forth in the Revenue Act which are not pertinent to this case. After having determined the gross income of the taxpayer, the next step provided by the statute for arriving at the income upon which the tax is computed is to deduct from the so-called gross income such deductions as the statutes permit, such as all the ordinary and necessary expenses paid or incurred during the taxable year in carrying on any trade or business, including salaries, commissions, or other compensation for services actually rendered, traveling expenses, which includes the entire amount expended for meals and lodging while away from home in pursuit of a trade or business, and such other deductions as charitable contributions, interest paid on debts, taxes paid, and such other deductions authorized by law, which are not pertinent here. All right, and on that note, that will conclude our literary and jury charge practice.